Chicago had a way of moving on quickly. Snow melted. Traffic resumed its usual impatient rhythm along the expressways. Office towers filled again each morning with people carrying coffee cups and deadlines. But gossip moved even faster than the city itself. 3 days after the dinner, Olivia Carter walked into the glass lobby of Bennett & Rowe Marketing and felt the shift immediately. No one said anything. That was the unsettling part. The receptionist smiled politely. "Morning, Olivia." "Morning." But the smile lingered a little too long, as if it carried an unspoken question. Olivia stepped into the elevator and watched the numbers climb toward the 23rd floor. 2 junior associates stood behind her, whispering quietly about a campaign meeting. When Olivia stepped out onto the floor, the whispers stopped, then resumed once she passed. Her heels clicked steadily across the polished floor. It was subtle, nothing she could point to directly, but Olivia had spent nearly a decade building her reputation in Chicago's marketing world. She understood how people communicated without speaking. A glance held half a second too long, a conversation that paused when she approached, a message notification lighting up on someone's phone. The dinner had been private, but Chicago's professional circles overlapped in ways that made privacy fragile. Lucas Whitmore moved in venture capital, Daniel Carter in corporate law, Olivia in high-level marketing strategy. Their worlds intersected at charity events, networking dinners, industry panels. Someone had recognized them that night, and someone had talked. Olivia reached her office and closed the door. Her phone buzzed. Another message. Not from Lucas. From Clara Bennett, the senior partner. "Come see me when you arrive." Olivia stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she stood. Clara Bennett's office overlooked the Chicago River. The winter light reflected off the glass buildings outside, casting sharp lines across the room. Clara didn't invite her to sit immediately. Instead, she studied Olivia with the careful expression of someone deciding how much honesty a conversation required. "You've had an interesting week," Clara said. Olivia felt her throat tighten. "I'm not sure what you mean." Clara sighed softly. "Olivia," she gestured toward the chair. "Please." Olivia sat. Clara folded her hands on the desk. "There's a story circulating," she said, "about a dinner at the Langford." Olivia looked down at her hands. Clara continued carefully. "I normally ignore personal rumors. People's marriages are not the company's concern." Olivia exhaled slowly. But Lucas Whitmore is involved in several of our investment partnerships." The weight of that statement settled in the room. "And his wife," Clara added, "sits on the board of a non-profit we represent." Olivia closed her eyes briefly. Clara's voice softened. "I need to know if this situation is going to become public." Olivia opened her eyes. "I don't know." Clara nodded slowly. "That's what worries me." Silence filled the office. Finally, Clara leaned back. "Take the rest of the week off," she said. Olivia blinked. "I can still work." "I'm sure you can," Clara replied gently. "But right now, the firm needs calm." The word calm sounded dangerously close to distance. Olivia stood. "I understand." Clara watched her carefully. "Do you?" Olivia didn't answer. Across the city, Daniel Carter sat alone in his law office. The skyline stretched wide outside the window, Lake Michigan glowing pale under the winter sky. His desk was covered with documents he hadn't read. For 3 days his phone had been unusually active. Messages from colleagues, careful questions from acquaintances, a brief, awkward email from Lucas Whitmore requesting a private conversation. Daniel ignored it. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. When he had imagined confronting Olivia, he thought he would feel something afterward. Relief, justice, closure. Instead, there was only a strange, hollow quiet. His phone buzzed again. A message from Olivia. "The firm asked me to take time off." Daniel stared at the words. He hadn't intended for things to reach this far. Exposing the truth had seemed simple in theory, but truth, once released, had a way of spreading far beyond the original wound. Daniel looked out at the grey winter water. For the first time since the dinner, a difficult thought surfaced. Had revenge solved anything, or had he simply destroyed what little remained of their life together? The Carter condo had never felt so large. Olivia stood in the living room, staring at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. Winter light filled the apartment with a pale grey glow, reflecting off the polished hardwood floors and the minimalist furniture they had chosen together years ago. For 10 years, the space had represented success, a quiet luxury, stability, the life she believed she wanted. Now, it felt like a museum of choices she no longer understood. Daniel had been sleeping in the guest room for 3 nights. They barely spoke. The silence between them moved through the apartment like a third presence, something heavy and uninvited that lingered in every hallway. Olivia walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. Half a bottle of white wine sat on the top shelf. She poured a glass even though it was barely noon. Her phone lay on the counter. Lucas's name still sat at the top of her recent calls. But there had been no messages for 2 days. At first he had tried. 3 calls the morning after the dinner. 2 texts. "We need to talk. This isn't how things were supposed to happen." Olivia never responded. She had spent the last week realizing something uncomfortable about the man she thought she loved. Lucas had promised freedom, excitement. a life beyond the slow routines of marriage. But the moment the situation turned complicated, he disappeared. Olivia took a slow sip of wine. The taste was sharper than she expected. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to ask a question she had carefully avoided. Had she really been in love with Lucas, or had she simply been trying to escape the quiet emptiness that had grown between her and Daniel? The thought made her chest tighten. She set the glass down. In the bedroom hallway, a door closed softly. Daniel. Olivia hesitated. Then she walked toward the sound. Across the city, Rebecca Whitmore sat alone in the kitchen of her townhouse. The house was too quiet. Lucas had moved into a hotel the night after the dinner. At first, Rebecca thought she might feel relief, but the quiet had only made everything sharper. Every room carried the memory of ordinary life. Morning coffee together before work. Evening dinners that now felt rehearsed in hindsight. 12 years of routines that suddenly seemed fragile. Her phone rested on the table. A message from Lucas blinked on the screen. "Please talk to me." Rebecca stared at it. She remembered the way he had looked at Olivia in the restaurant. Not guilt, not even shame. Recognition. The kind that only existed between two people who had shared something intimate. Rebecca closed her eyes. For years she had believed her marriage was steady simply because it had never exploded. Now she realized something harder. Sometimes marriages don't break suddenly. Sometimes they erode slowly while both people pretend not to notice. She picked up her phone, then set it back down again. Not yet. Daniel Carter stood near the frozen shoreline of Lake Michigan. The wind of the water cut through his coat as he watched the gray waves crash quietly against the rocks. Chicago stretched behind him, glass towers rising into the pale winter sky. The city looked exactly the same as it had a week ago, but Daniel felt as though something inside his life had shifted permanently. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. Instead, he watched a lone jogger pass along the lakefront path. For days, people had told him the same thing. "You did the right thing. She deserved to be exposed. Anyone would have done the same." But none of those words brought the satisfaction he expected. He had imagined confronting Olivia would end something cleanly. Instead, it had only revealed how broken things had already been. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. Olivia's message from earlier still sat on the screen. "The firm asked me to take time off." He stared at the words for a long moment. Then another thought surfaced. For 10 years, Olivia had been more than just his wife. She had been the person who knew every quiet corner of his life. Now she was becoming a stranger, and Daniel wasn't sure whether he felt relieved or devastated. The wind picked up across the water. Daniel slipped his phone back into his pocket and looked out over the cold horizon. Revenge had been simple. Living with the aftermath was something else entirely. That evening, the condo felt unusually quiet. Chicago's skyline shimmered across the dark water of Lake Michigan, the lights reflecting faintly through the wide glass windows of the living room. Olivia stood near the kitchen counter, her fingers wrapped loosely around the mug of tea that had long since gone cold. She heard the door unlock. Daniel stepped inside. His coat carried the sharp scent of winter air. He paused briefly near the entrance, as if uncertain whether the apartment still belonged to both of them. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them had become familiar over the past week, but tonight it felt different, less like avoidance and more like something waiting to happen. Olivia spoke first. "You were at the lake." Daniel looked at her, mildly surprised. "You could tell? You always go there when you need to think." He set his keys on the small table near the door. Old habits. Olivia nodded faintly. They stood across the room from each other, the distance between them filled with everything that had happened. Finally, Daniel walked into the living room and sat down on the couch. "I spoke with my lawyer today," he said. Olivia's grip tightened slightly around the mug. "About the divorce?" "Yes." The words settled into the room quietly. Olivia stared down at the surface of her tea. "What happens now?" she asked. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "We can file quietly," he said. "No court drama. No public filings beyond what's necessary." He paused. "It would be quick." Olivia nodded slowly. "That's probably best." Daniel studied her face. There was no relief there, only exhaustion. "You don't sound convinced," he said. She gave a faint humorless smile. "I'm not sure I'm convinced about anything anymore." Daniel leaned back against the couch. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he spoke again. "Why him?" The question was simple, but it carried the weight of everything they had avoided discussing. Olivia closed her eyes briefly. "You deserve an honest answer. I think we're past the point of polite ones." She walked slowly across the room and sat down in the chair opposite him. For the first time in days, they were truly looking at each other. "It wasn't just Lucas," she said quietly. Daniel's expression didn't change. "I assumed as much." Olivia exhaled slowly. "For a long time, I felt like I was disappearing." The words came carefully at first, like something fragile. "Our lives became routines," she continued. "Work, dinner, sleep, the same conversations every week." Daniel listened without interrupting. "I know marriage is settled," she said, "but somewhere along the way, we stopped seeing each other." Her voice trembled slightly. "I would tell you about my day, and you'd nod without looking up from your emails." Daniel lowered his gaze. "And you stopped asking about mine." He couldn't argue with that. Olivia continued quietly. When Lucas started paying attention to me, it felt intoxicating. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't stop her. He listened, she said. He remembered things I said weeks earlier. He made me feel like I was still someone interesting. The room fell silent again. Finally, Daniel spoke. So you chose him? Olivia shook her head slowly. No. Daniel looked at her. I chose the feeling. The honesty in the statement landed harder than any accusation. Daniel stood and walked toward the window overlooking the lake. Snow had begun falling again, drifting softly across the city lights. Do you love him? He asked quietly. Olivia didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded smaller than before. I don't know. Daniel turned slightly. What does that mean? It means, she said slowly, that everything I thought I felt now looks different. Daniel studied her for a long moment. Lucas hasn't called in days. The statement hung in the air. Olivia gave a faint nod. I noticed. Daniel looked back toward the dark water outside. And you still want to leave? The question seemed to surprise her. She sat very still. I thought I did, she admitted. Daniel turned toward her again. And now? Olivia met his eyes. Now there were tears there. Not dramatic, not desperate. Just quiet and tired. Now I think we both have to decide something harder. Daniel waited. Whether our marriage ended because of Lucas, she said softly, or because we stopped fighting for it long before he appeared. The truth between them finally stood in the open. Neither of them knew what to do with it yet. Spring arrived slowly in Chicago. The gray winter finally loosened its grip on the city, and the ice along Lake Michigan broke apart into dark, shifting water. The lakefront paths filled again with runners, cyclists, and people rediscovering sunlight after months of cold. Life had resumed its rhythm, but the people who had sat at that restaurant table months earlier were no longer living the same lives. Olivia Carter stood outside a small cafe in Lincoln Park, adjusting the strap of her bag as she waited for a coffee. Her life looked quieter now. After the scandal spread through several professional circles, Bennett and Rowe had gently encouraged her to explore new opportunities. It had been a careful corporate phrase for something less delicate. She no longer worked downtown. Instead, she had accepted a consulting role with a smaller marketing firm, less prestige, fewer clients, but also fewer eyes watching her. At first, the change had felt like a punishment. Now, it felt strangely honest. She took her coffee and stepped outside into the soft April sunlight. Chicago moved around her in the easy, familiar chaos of spring traffic. Lucas Whitmore had disappeared from her life entirely. His firm quietly transferred him to their New York office within weeks of the dinner. They never spoke again. For a long time, Olivia believed losing him would feel devastating. Instead, it felt like waking from a dream she didn't fully trust anymore. Some illusions only survive in secrecy. Once exposed, they rarely look the same. Her phone buzzed, a calendar reminder, therapy appointment. She hesitated for a moment before putting the phone back into her bag. It had taken time to admit something she once avoided. The affair had been less about Lucas, and more about the emptiness she had never learned how to confront. Across the city, Rebecca Whitmore locked the door to her townhouse. The house no longer felt silent. Lucas had asked to return several times. Each time Rebecca listened carefully before answering. But something had shifted permanently inside her. The trust she once assumed had been quietly replaced by something else, clarity. 3 months after the dinner, she filed for divorce. It wasn't dramatic. There were no shouting matches, no scenes in public, just paperwork and a calm conversation where she finally admitted the truth to herself. Their marriage had been slowly fading long before the affair. Sometimes betrayal only reveals what was already broken. She stepped outside and walked toward her car. For the first time in years, she felt something close to freedom. Not happiness, not yet, but space. And sometimes that was enough. Daniel Carter stood once again near the shoreline of Lake Michigan, the same place he had visited during the cold days after the dinner. But the air felt different now, warmer, softer, carrying the scent of spring. His phone rested in his pocket. The divorce papers had been finalized 2 weeks earlier. It had happened quietly, just as he promised. No courtroom battles, no public drama. Just 2 signatures acknowledging the end of something that had once felt permanent. Daniel watched the waves roll slowly toward the rocks. For months, he had asked himself the same question. Had confronting Olivia that night been worth it? He still didn't know the answer. But something else had become clearer over time. The affair had not destroyed their marriage. The silence had. Years of polite conversations that never touched the real problems. Years of assuming the other person would simply remain. The betrayal had only exposed what they had both ignored. Daniel took a slow breath and looked across the wide horizon. Some marriages ended in explosions. Others faded quietly until someone finally turned on the light. That night in the restaurant had been that moment. Not revenge, not justice, just truth. And sometimes truth arrived too late to save what once existed, but not too late to understand it. Daniel turned and began walking along the lakefront path, disappearing into the steady movement of the city. Chicago continued forward, and so finally did he. The restaurant was warm with candlelight, the kind of quiet Manhattan evening where marriages look perfect from across the room. Laughter drifted between tables, wine glasses clinked softly, and Daniel thought the night would pass like any other anniversary dinner. Then his wife leaned back in her chair and said calmly, "I'm leaving you." Daniel didn't argue. He simply smiled, because at that exact moment, the restaurant door opened, and someone she never expected to see stepped inside. Some secrets don't explode loudly. They arrive quietly and change everything. If stories about love, betrayal, and the fragile truth behind perfect lives intrigue you, stay a little longer. There are many doors in this world that haven't been opened yet. The restaurant overlooked the frozen edge of Lake Michigan, its tall windows reflecting the quiet glow of Chicago's winter skyline. Inside, everything felt warm, golden lights, soft jazz drifting from hidden speakers, the low murmur of conversations that blended into a comforting hum. Daniel Carter sat across from his wife and watched her swirl the wine in her glass. It was their 10th wedding anniversary. At least, that was what the reservation said. Olivia Carter looked exactly like the woman strangers admired from a distance. Poised posture, dark hair falling effortlessly over one shoulder, a navy dress that suggested elegance without trying too hard. She had always understood how to occupy a room. Tonight, though, she seemed distracted. Her phone rested beside her plate, screen facing down. Daniel noticed everything about it, the way she occasionally glanced toward it, the faint tension in her shoulders, the slight delay before she responded to his casual questions. It was the kind of observation that came naturally after 20 years of studying people in courtrooms. Traffic wasn't too bad tonight, Daniel said lightly. Olivia nodded, barely looking up. Chicago's been quieter lately. Winter scares people away. She gave a polite smile. For a moment, they both watched the snow drift past the window. Outside, headlights slid along Lakeshore Drive like slow rivers of light. The waiter refilled their glasses. Daniel lifted his wine and studied the deep red color. He remembered the first time they shared a bottle together, years ago, when they were young and living in a cramped apartment in Wicker Park. Back when silence between them felt comfortable. Now it felt staged. Olivia set her fork down carefully. "Daniel," she said. Something in her tone made him look up. Her expression had shifted into the calm professional composure she used during corporate presentations. It was the voice she used when decisions had already been made. "I think we should talk." Daniel leaned back slightly. "We are talking." She inhaled slowly, as if rehearsing the words again in her mind. "I'm leaving you." The sentence landed softly on the table between them. No shouting, no drama, just a simple declaration. A nearby couple laughed at something across the room. Glasses clinked. A waiter carried a tray of desserts past their table. Life continued normally around them. Daniel studied Olivia's face. She expected anger, confusion, maybe pleading. Instead, he smiled. Not a mocking smile, not even an emotional one. Just a calm, almost curious smile. Olivia frowned. That's not the reaction I expected. Daniel folded his hands on the table. "What reaction were you hoping for?" "I don't know, something human." "That hurts," he said mildly. She hesitated. "Daniel, please don't make this difficult." He tilted his head. "Difficult?" "Yes, I didn't plan for this to happen, but things change, people change." "Of course they do." She seemed relieved that he wasn't arguing. "I've been unhappy for a long time," she continued, "and I think you know that." Daniel nodded slowly. "I do." Olivia blinked. "You do?" "Yes." For a moment she seemed unsure how to proceed. Daniel glanced toward the entrance of the restaurant. The glass door opened. Cold air slipped briefly inside as a woman stepped through the doorway, brushing snow from her coat. Daniel's smile widened slightly. Olivia followed his gaze. At first, she didn't recognize the woman walking toward them. Then her face went pale. "Daniel," she whispered. He calmly lifted his wineglass. "Olivia," he said softly, "there's someone I think you should meet." The woman stopped beside their table. "Daniel Carter?" she asked politely. "Yes," he said, standing. He gestured toward Olivia. "This is my wife." The woman nodded once. Then she said the words that made Olivia's fingers tighten around the edge of the table. "Rebecca Whitmore." Olivia's breathing stopped, because Lucas Whitmore had a wife, and she was standing right here. For several seconds, no one spoke. The restaurant's soft jazz continued drifting through the air, absurdly calm against the silence that had settled over the table. Plates clinked somewhere behind them. A waiter passed with a tray of cocktails, oblivious to the quiet detonation unfolding beside the window. Olivia Carter stared at the woman standing next to Daniel. Rebecca Whitmore. The name echoed in her head like a sudden crack in glass. Rebecca looked composed, in the way women sometimes do when they have spent hours preparing themselves not to fall apart in public. Her coat hung neatly over her arm, revealing a charcoal dress and a thin silver necklace resting at her collarbone. Olivia noticed something strange about her expression. There was no rage, no tears, just a steady, searching calm. Daniel pulled out a chair. "Please," he said gently, "join us." Rebecca hesitated for only a moment before sitting down. Olivia's heartbeat had begun to pound loudly in her ears. Lucas had mentioned his wife exactly twice. Both times in vague, dismissive ways, something about a distant marriage, a relationship already fading long before Olivia entered the picture. He had never mentioned her name, and Olivia had never asked. Now Rebecca Whitmore was sitting across the table. Reality suddenly felt too sharp. Olivia forced a polite smile. "I'm sorry," she said carefully. "I think there must be some confusion." Rebecca looked at her with quiet interest. "Is there?" Daniel sipped his wine. The faintest hint of amusement flickered in his eyes. Olivia turned toward him, her voice tightening slightly. Daniel, what exactly is going on? He placed his glass down with slow precision. Well, he said, I thought tonight might be a good opportunity for everyone to finally meet. Rebecca folded her hands together on the table. Daniel contacted me this afternoon, she said calmly. Olivia's stomach dropped.
Daniel had contacted her? When he said he had information about my husband, Rebecca continued, I was curious. The word husband landed heavily in the air. Olivia felt heat rise into her face. Across the table, Daniel remained perfectly composed. You said you wanted honesty tonight, he said quietly to Olivia. She stared at him. I didn't say that. You said you were leaving me, Daniel corrected gently, which I assume meant honesty had finally become fashionable again. Rebecca watched the exchange closely. Lucas told me he had a late meeting tonight, she said. The room suddenly felt smaller. Olivia forced herself to breathe slowly. Lucas Whitmore works in venture capital, she said cautiously. Chicago is a small professional circle. I've met him at events before. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Events. Rebecca's gaze shifted toward Olivia's face. Her voice remained calm, but something inside it had sharpened. Yes, Rebecca said. Lucas attends many events. Olivia's hands tightened slightly under the table. Daniel reached for the breadbasket. Olivia, he said casually, why don't you tell Rebecca how you two met? Olivia's chest tightened. There's nothing to tell. Rebecca studied her for a long moment. You know, Rebecca said softly, when Daniel called me, he didn't immediately tell me the woman's name. Olivia felt a slow, creeping dread. He said he thought I deserved to know the truth, Rebecca continued, but he also said the woman might prefer to explain things herself. The silence thickened. At the next table, someone laughed loudly at a joke. Olivia suddenly became aware of how visible they were, 4 adults sitting too stiffly around the white tablecloth. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. Daniel, this is unnecessary. He tilted his head. Is it? Yes. Rebecca spoke again. Lucas and I have been married 12 years. Olivia swallowed. Congratulations, she said weakly. Rebecca ignored the comment. About 3 months ago, she continued, he started coming home later. Daniel's eyes drifted toward the window. Snow continued falling outside. Rebecca's voice remained calm, but there was a fracture beneath it now. New passwords, late meetings, business trips that didn't quite make sense. Olivia stared down at her untouched wine. Rebecca leaned forward slightly. I suppose that's when wives begin noticing things. Daniel smiled faintly. Lawyers too. Olivia's patience snapped. Daniel, she said sharply, what exactly are you trying to accomplish here? He met her eyes. For 10 years, he said quietly, I believe we were living the same life. His voice remained calm. But lately I realized we might be living very different ones. Rebecca's gaze moved slowly between them. Then she asked the question that froze the air at the table. Olivia, she said softly, how long have you known my husband? Olivia opened her mouth. No sound came out. And for the first time that evening, Daniel stopped smiling. The question lingered over the table like smoke. Olivia stared at Rebecca Whitmore, her mind racing for something, anything, that might restore control to the evening. How long have you known my husband? Rebecca's voice had been quiet, but the weight behind it pressed into Olivia's chest. Olivia reached for her wine glass, though she didn't drink. The stem trembled slightly between her fingers. I told you, she said carefully. We've met at a few events. Rebecca didn't respond immediately. She studied Olivia's face with a patience that was somehow more unsettling than anger. Daniel remained silent. Outside the window, headlights slid slowly along Lakeshore Drive. Snow continued falling, dusting the city in a quiet, indifferent white. Rebecca leaned back in her chair. When Daniel called me today, she said, I already knew Lucas was seeing someone. Olivia felt a sharp drop in her stomach. Rebecca continued. I didn't know who. Her voice remained controlled, but there was something raw beneath the surface now. A quiet exhaustion that had nothing to do with this dinner. I found messages, she said. Daniel's gaze drifted to his folded hands. Lucas has always been careful, Rebecca went on. But people make mistakes when they think no one is watching. Olivia swallowed. What kind of mistakes? Rebecca's eyes flicked toward her. The kind where someone forgets to delete a notification. Daniel spoke for the first time in several minutes. That's usually how it begins. Olivia turned toward him sharply. What is that supposed to mean? Daniel's tone remained mild. It means people rarely hide things as well as they believe. Rebecca glanced between them. Daniel told me something interesting earlier, she said. Olivia felt a tightening in her chest. Rebecca continued slowly. He said he didn't discover the affair all at once. Daniel gave a faint nod. Patterns, he said simply. Olivia laughed under her breath, though it came out thin. You're turning this into a courtroom now? Daniel shrugged slightly. I suppose old habits are hard to break. Rebecca watched him with quiet curiosity. How did you know? She asked. Daniel looked down at the tablecloth for a moment, as though considering how much to say. It started small, he said. Olivia's pulse quickened. A phone lighting up at midnight, Daniel continued. Messages turned away from the room. Late meetings that happened a little too often. Olivia's voice sharpened. So you decided to spy on me? Daniel met her eyes. No. His calmness somehow made the word heavier. I simply started paying attention. Rebecca leaned forward slightly. And eventually you found Lucas. Daniel nodded. Eventually. Olivia set her glass down harder than she intended. This is unbelievable. Her voice had risen slightly, drawing a curious glance from a nearby table. She lowered it quickly. You spent months investigating your own wife? Daniel's expression softened slightly. I spent months realizing my wife had already left the marriage. The words landed with quiet finality. Olivia's chest tightened. That's not fair, isn't it? She leaned toward him, anger finally breaking through her composure. You could have talked to me. Daniel held her gaze. I tried. The memory flickered between them, dozens of small conversations Olivia had dismissed over the past year. Rebecca spoke again, her voice steady. I should probably clarify something. Both of them turned toward her. When Daniel contacted me, he didn't accuse anyone. She paused. He asked a question. Olivia felt cold. Rebecca continued. He asked if my husband had been spending time with someone named Olivia. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Daniel had said her name. Rebecca's eyes rested calmly on Olivia now. Lucas never told me who she was, Rebecca said, but Daniel seemed very certain. Olivia looked at her husband. How? The single word barely left her lips. Daniel exhaled slowly. There's a hotel on Michigan Avenue, he said. Olivia's breath stopped. Rebecca's eyes sharpened slightly. Daniel continued calmly. But Langford. Olivia's fingers curled against the tablecloth. You and Lucas checked in there 4 times in the past 2 months. Rebecca's face went completely still. Olivia stared at him. You followed me? Daniel shook his head. No. He paused. I subpoenaed the billing records. Rebecca blinked. You what? Daniel's tone remained calm. Lucas's firm represents several clients my firm works with. Certain financial disclosures become surprisingly visible when you know where to look. Olivia's anger flared. This is insane. Daniel met her gaze again. No, he said quietly. It's thorough. Rebecca leaned back slowly, absorbing the information. For the first time, something close to pain flickered across her face. Then she turned toward Olivia again. So, she said softly, this is you. Olivia felt the room closing in around her. Humiliation burned through her chest. Guilt pressed against it. And beneath both of them, a rising anger toward the man sitting calmly across from her. Daniel Carter had planned this entire moment, every second of it. And suddenly, Olivia realized something far more terrifying than being exposed. He had known long before tonight. The silence at the table stretched longer than any of them expected. Rebecca Whitmore sat motionless, her hands folded neatly in front of her, as if still deciding what part of the evening belonged to anger and what part belonged to disbelief. Olivia felt like the air had been drained from the room. Daniel Carter, meanwhile, seemed almost detached from the moment. His wineglass rested lightly between his fingers, his expression calm in the way of someone who had already walked through this emotional storm long before tonight. The restaurant continued humming around them. A server stopped briefly beside the table. Is everything all right here? Daniel smiled politely. Yes, thank you. The server nodded and walked away. The illusion of normalcy returned. Then Olivia's phone vibrated. The sharp buzz against the table made her flinch. She stared at the screen. Lucas. 3 missed calls, 2 messages. Her chest tightened. Rebecca noticed. Is that him? She asked quietly. Olivia didn't answer. The phone vibrated again. This time the screen lit up fully. Lucas calling. Rebecca's eyes settled on the glowing screen. So it is. Olivia quickly turned the phone face down. But the moment had already happened. Daniel exhaled softly through his nose. Well, he said, that's convenient timing. Rebecca reached for her own purse. I told him to come. Olivia's head snapped up. You what? Rebecca met her gaze calmly. After Daniel called me this afternoon, I sent Lucas a message. Her voice remained steady. I told him we needed to talk. Tonight. Olivia felt something cold slide down her spine. You didn't tell him about this? Rebecca shook her head. No. Daniel leaned slightly back in his chair. Then, this should be interesting. Olivia glared at him. You're enjoying this. He held her gaze without flinching. No, he said quietly. I'm finishing it. Before she could respond, the restaurant door opened again. Cold air slipped into the room. Olivia felt it before she saw him. Lucas Whitmore stepped inside. Tall, sharply dressed, his dark coat dusted lightly with snow. The kind of man who carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to closing deals worth millions. His eyes scanned the restaurant quickly. Then he saw the table, and stopped. For a moment he simply stared. Rebecca, Olivia, Daniel, all sitting together. Lucas's expression shifted, first confusion, then calculation. He approached slowly. Rebecca didn't move. Olivia felt her pulse hammering in her throat. Lucas reached the table. Rebecca, he said carefully. What's going on? Rebecca gestured calmly to the empty chair beside her. Sit down. Lucas looked at Olivia. She couldn't hold his gaze. Daniel stood and extended his hand politely. Lucas Whitmore, I presume. Lucas hesitated before shaking it. And you are? Daniel Carter. The name seemed to land somewhere behind Lucas's eyes. Understanding flickered, very faint but unmistakable. Lucas sat. The four of them now formed a quiet square around the table. Lucas forced a small smile. "Well," he said lightly, "this is unexpected." Rebecca studied him. "I'd say that's accurate." Lucas turned to Olivia. "What's happening here?" Before she could answer, Daniel spoke. "Your wife and mine were just getting acquainted." Lucas's jaw tightened slightly. Rebecca leaned forward. "I asked Olivia how long she's known you." Lucas looked at Olivia again.
The silent exchange between them lasted less than a second, but it was enough. Rebecca noticed. Daniel noticed. Lucas straightened in his chair. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," he said smoothly. Rebecca's voice remained calm. "Then explain it." Lucas glanced briefly around the restaurant. Other diners continued their conversations, unaware of the quiet storm at the corner table. "Rebecca," he said carefully, "this isn't the place for—" Daniel interrupted gently. "The Langford Hotel on Michigan Avenue seems to have worked out quite well." Lucas froze. The shift in his expression was small, but devastating. Rebecca turned slowly toward him. "What did he just say?" Lucas's voice hardened. "Daniel, was it?" Daniel lifted his glass again. "That's right." Lucas leaned forward, his composure cracking slightly. "You had no right." "No right to what?" Daniel asked calmly. Lucas stopped. Rebecca's eyes were now locked on him. "Lucas," she said quietly. "How many times?" He didn't answer. Olivia felt the weight of the moment crushing down on her. Lucas finally exhaled. "This is ridiculous." Rebecca's voice softened. "Is it?" Lucas looked at Olivia again. For the first time since arriving, something like fear flickered across his face. And Daniel Carter watched the entire thing unfold with the quiet patience of someone who had already predicted every move on the board. The lies were beginning to collapse, and there was no way back now.